I'm Darren Bader, and welcome to the sale of my practice. Is anyone from my gallery here? Thanks for coming. I've been meaning to say how much I appreciate our relationship. No, actually, sorry. Darren can't make it tonight. One or both of his children are sick, but he sends his regards. My name is Alexander Provan. I'm the editor of Triple Canopy. Thank you for coming to Hard Sell, a conversation about the commercialization of identities and whether to cash in or opt out, and maybe how best to do so. As you probably know, this conversation is prompted by a work by Darren Bader, the sale of his practice as an artist, which basically means the legal right to use his name to produce art. So we've recently published a number of works related to this, which I'll describe in a sec. But the basic situation tonight is that we will show a film by Pacho Velez about the project, the sale of Darren's practice. And then we will have a conversation with Rachel Hunter-Himes, David Levine, James and Kienitz Wilkins, and Dena Yago. And that will go on for about 45 minutes or an hour. And then we'll have a Q&A. And that's about it. So before we begin and before I introduce the participants, I just want to give a brief overview to those of you who aren't familiar. On March 7th, 2023, the conceptual artist Darren Bader announced the sale of his practice, offering the legal right to make art under his name for a price to be determined. Comparing himself to dentists, doctors, and lawyers who pass on the keys to a business, Bader expressed confidence in the arrangement, quote, benefiting buyer and seller. Since his debut 2 decades ago, Bader has been remarkably successful for an artist who favors ready-mades and assemblages composed of worn-out consumer goods, eBay memorabilia, personal artifacts, and language games. He's been celebrated by critics as well as intrepid collectors for defying the dictates of the market, and his work has been exhibited at prestigious venues such as MoMA PS1 and the Venice Biennale. Recently, though, the value of Bader's practice, the stock of his name, and the demand for his work has come into question. Established art practice for sale in New York consists of 3 works related to Bader's effort to cash in on his record and reputation, developed in conversation with the artist. They document the sale and consider questions about the commercialization of culture, the conversion of individuals, especially so-called creatives, into brands and the market for identities. So these works, which I encourage you to take a look at on our website, include the film I just mentioned, For Sale by Owner, Darren Bader, directed by Pacho Velez, which features Anicka Yi, Dena Yago, and Kelly Taxter. If Anicka or Kelly are here tonight? Okay, well, in spirit. And an essay I wrote about Bader's value and the conditions that motivated him to put a price on his name. And Agreement for Sale of Art Practice, Darren Bader, which is a contract for the sale of his practice, outlining the rights and obligations of the buyer and seller, and drafted with the lawyer Alfred David Steiner, who is here tonight. And the agreement articulates the legal basis for commodifying and transferring the artist's name. So before we get started, I'll briefly introduce our participants. Rachel Hunter-Himes is a museum worker, critic, and scholar researching representations of race in the material culture and decorative arts of 18th and 19th century Europe, and she has written about contemporary critiques of museum finance and labor. Pacho Velez, who's also with us tonight, makes films about the shifting signifiers that some might call people, which is one of my favorite bios, Pacho. Beat that, I think you can all learn a lesson from that bio. His most recent feature, Searchers, premiered at Sundance. David Levine is an artist and writer based in New York and a longtime contributor to Triple Canopy, which I think is a part of the bio that we inserted. But thank you, David, for allowing us to do so. Yeah, I mean, no one puts triple canopy in their bio. His work has often probed the slippage between performance and life, public and private, character and person. James N. Kienitz Wilkins is a filmmaker and artist whose experimental documentaries have explored, among other things, the ready-made screenplay, satirical reenactments, leaky dreams, intimate plagiarism, and the performance of the role of the artist. His new excellent film, still film, debuted last month at BAM. And Dena Yago is an artist, writer, and cultural strategist. She was a founding member of the trend forecasting group K-Hole and has written and spoken, among other things, about the transformation of artworks and installations into attractions, why art collectives end, and, quote, the temporality of debt and the speed of communication demanded from cognitive and affective workers. So I just want to quickly thank Pacho for his amazing work on this film and for so energetically enduring our comments and our weirdly articulated enthusiasm, and also Lydia Cornett and Francisco Acosta, who shot and edited the film, and they're also here. Thanks again to Dave Steiner for his guidance and work on the legal agreement. Thanks to Dena again for appearing in the film, and also to Kelly and Anicka, and thank you to Darren for his years of service. I think now we will watch the film, which is about 10 minutes long. And in case I forget to say it at the end, you should feel free to stick around and have a drink afterwards, especially if you still want to talk to some of the people who are involved after the conversation officially ends. Thank you for coming.
So if you could start just by introducing yourself and telling us how you know Darren.
My name is Anicka Yi, and I am an artist, and I know Darren Bader. You're putting me on the spot. I didn't realize I had to do some math here. I met him ages ago, but I don't remember how.
Tell me about your first impressions, what you remember of them.
You know, world weary, but also quite childlike, but in that sort of hopeful way, even in his most sort of state of despair. I think there was always that glisten of hope with him. This sounds strange, like this is kind of a posthumous interview. I don't mean it like that.
So he's about to sell his identity.
Well, are we talking about the identity or the person? Because maybe we can find glitches in between.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Darren. It is Rachel and Matt.
Hi, Darren.
Hello, Rachel and Matt. How are you guys?
We're doing well.
Well, do you think you can just give us an update of where things stand right now?
Yeah, things have really remained very much the same.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, there are moments when thinking of it, I certainly ask myself what the fuck I'm thinking.
Darren Bader is an artist. He's a conceptual artist. And a lot of his work is about value, about what can be an artwork, how that works in the context of the market. And this work has done very well historically, especially in the late aughts and early 2010s. He was in the Whitney Biennial, he won the Calder Prize. But now in 2023, Darren is selling his artistic identity. He's doing this as an artwork. He's selling a contract. Whoever buys it gets the right to make art as Darren Bader, and Darren loses that right.
Again, this is something I've been considering for a period, and it continues to feel correct. I'm not taking on the mantle of anything, of any major import.
short of, again, I feel this is intuitive. I intuit this is correct. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So I think my first impressions of Darren were as someone who's slightly nervous and neurotic, maybe a little bit uncomfortable in the situations, but I was familiar with his work from Rivington Arms, which was a scene at the time.
I don't exactly remember the first time I met Darren. I remember, though, that he was the guy that looked like Bob Dylan. And I think at that time, when I heard about him, he might have been living in LA. And then when I met him, in fact, he did sort of look like Bob Dylan. Like, they were right. The rumors were true.
Yeah, I was avoiding saying that because I figured probably everyone would say that. And I remember he would always roll his eyes because he got that quite a bit. And you know, in this town, nobody wants to sound unoriginal.
Pre-2008, there's this moment where it felt like being an artist was something that would be financially remunerated. That possibility was on the table. And then in 2008, I'd say that bottomed out quite a bit. Rivington Arms closed. I think these are the cycles that just happen in the art world.
Paintings were really foregrounded for very you know, obvious reasons, because they are the market that keeps the lights on.
You look around at all the galleries and they're all showing like painting, you know, not that there's anything wrong with painting, but it's not very diverse out there in terms of mediums. If I put myself in his shoes, yeah, I could imagine a sort of sense of like exhaustion or a sort of built-in entropy to the project of being a young artist that then becomes a mid-career artist and sort of plateaus.
Mid-career or approaching mid-career artists are thinking about some sort of exodus in a way that makes sense. And this project that Darren has conceived of, it seems like a very nice, playful way of foregrounding the brutality of what would compel someone to do this. Yeah.
So lately, Darren's been talking about selling his practice, his life as an artist, his art, not everything he's made, but everything he might make. I think it's brilliant. I think it makes complete sense in a way. On another level, I find it frightening for him. At the same time, I don't see why he couldn't call himself Darren Bader II and just keep on going.
But it's also like trying to sell something on eBay and being like, I think this shit sucks now, but you can give me a lot of money for it, you know?
It could be read as a little dubious, because how are we meant to interpret this? He doesn't want to be a white male artist because the climate isn't supporting him in that. So then should we just toss it aside and sell that? And then what is that worth? And is there value to that? And are there buyers?
If some sort of like nouveau riche Chinese guy is interested in like contemporary art purchased Darren Bader and just started making like hundreds of Darren Bader works in China, that'd be great, you know?
Maybe it'd be like an older lady from New Hampshire that, has been a painter her whole life and no one's looked at her work, and then she could just be Darren Bader. I don't know. That could be cool. Yeah. That might be one of the better outcomes.
Is there anything else that you want to tell me or that you feel I should ask?
Has he said what he's planning to do afterwards?
No.
Doing something else, I think that he's doing that already. He's become a father. He's embracing and really flourishing in this other part of life that often art doesn't allow you to have.
I mean, all the people that retired or said they were never going to make anything again have all come back, right?
But yeah, it's just, I'm a father of two, I'm 45, and I live in an obscenely expensive city, and I'm in a very significant amount of debt, and it's scary as fuck. I'd like to still make art in some fashion, especially if this thing doesn't sell, which it won't. So yeah, who knows?
My name is Rachel Ossip. As you saw on the documentary, I am the deputy editor of Triple Canopy, and we're so excited to be here tonight with Rachel Hunter-Hines, Dena Yago, David Levine, and James and Kienitz Wilkins. James, David, and Rachel are going to make some statements. We're going to ask some questions of Dena, and then we're going to open it up to a group conversation for about half an hour. And then after that point, we will see what kinds of questions you all have for these folks and, Darren and Spirit. So I'm going to pass things off to James, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thanks for having me. I've had a little cold lately. My voice has been troubling me. So I was thinking about this night on the train and decided to leave myself a little voice memo on my phone. So I'm going to play that now. I do not want to plug it in. The memo is called self-checkout. Self-checkout, self-checkout, self-checkout. My sister called me panicked. I was talking to a lawyer friend, she said. The lawyer friend told me about self-checkout. When you check yourself out at a store, a big store, a box store. They're cracking down on checking yourself out. And I thought of you, how you can't check yourself out of this one, brother. They know what you've been up to. They have your number. They literally have your number and so much more, you see, because you thought they were being lazy, cutting costs, making the consumer do the work of the cashier, automate it. And you thought, well, hell, if they ain't paying me or anyone else to bag my goods. Self-checkout, self-checkout, self-checkout. My sister called me panicked. All right, here we go. I was talking to a lawyer friend, she said. The lawyer friend told me about self-checkout. When you check yourself out at a store, a big store, a box store. They're cracking down on checking yourself out. And I thought of you, how you can't check yourself out of this one, brother. They know what you've been up to. They have your number. They literally have your number and so much more, you see, because you thought they were being lazy, cutting costs, making the consumer do the work of the cashier, automate it. And you thought, well, hell, if they ain't paying me or anyone else to bag my goods, I might as well pay myself. Someone's got to do it. You called it the Home Depot discount. And you see, my friend mentioned Home Depot. She said they're collecting evidence, checking you out, and waiting to strike. And I panicked because I know you do the self-checkout. I know it's your shrine, Home Depot that is. It's your safe space where you check yourself out every week, twice a weekend. You take your kids there to buy 2x4s, ready-mix concrete patch, super glue, and pipe insulation, and solar panel stakes for the garden, and tomato plants, and speed squares, and roofing caulk, and every variety of primer, and even dirt. You buy dirt at Home Depot. Who the hell buys dirt? You do. And each bag of dirt is going straight into your grave, I'm sure of that now, after I talk to my lawyer friend. Or, best case scenario, you'll be using that free hammer you pinched to fashion license plates for $1.15 an hour upstate in some god-awful state prison. The kind where if you're lucky, you can woo a matronly prison guard with sexual favors in order to escape for about a week before you get your ass shot in a cornfield on the border of Canada. At least in that case, you won't have to fashion license plates anymore. I know, at least they pay a wage in prison is what you're going to probably say. Well, that's the law, but you're always going to be paying so much more. Paying with your life, she said. My lawyer friend said this. You remember you met her at the wedding? I know she didn't act like a lawyer then. She wasn't a lawyer then, but she's a lawyer now. I know she got pretty drunk and did that thing with Derek, but some people do grow up. Some people do figure out how to support themselves, without stealing or expecting the system to stay the same, the same as it was when they were in their 20s and could drink a case of beer and wake up in the morning ready for just, more and more and more and more, as if that's sustainable. We know it's not sustainable, brother. The economy doesn't really give a shit about that kind of attitude, your attitude and your appetites. But anyways, she's a lawyer now and she still parties, don't get me wrong. She works hard, plays hard, and she deserves it. We definitely got over that thing she did with my ex. I don't mean Derek. I never dated Derek. Although in hindsight, I suppose I could have. It wasn't so thoughtful of her to do that thing she did with Derek on my wedding day, but we handled it very mature-like. So she knows what she's talking about, and I respect her. She's a very successful woman. So please, okay, hear me out, brother. I love you, I do, although I never say it. So that's exactly why you've got to trust me when I tell you that Home Depot is cracking down. They're cracking down on self-checkout. You can't just check out anymore, brother. My sister took a breath then. I sighed and said, I know. My sister said, I know you know, but do you know? I know what you're going to say, brother. You're going to say, there's no way they can prosecute me. You. There's no way they can prove you. I purposely let an item or 3 or 10 go unpaid for. What do they expect? I'm not a trained professional. I have no idea how to do self-checkout. I'm just a schmuck on any given Sunday trying to get my wood up on my wagon, my Subaru wagon. I can't help it if a pack of screws goes unaccounted for. They'd prosecute me for that? What is this, North Korea? Home despot? That's fucking fascism. Yeah, she continued, mimicking my voice in a way that made me sound extremely annoying. I know what your argument is. Oh, it's all a mistake. You see, my thievery is a critique of consumerism, of institutional racism, of Donald Trump. Because you see, the founder of Home Depot, Bernie Marcus, was one of the biggest donors to the 2016 campaign. He stole from us, so how can you call this theft? Right. You'll claim the moral high ground the whole time you're sneaking around the aisles, piling bags of mulch over strategically positioned hand tools and L brackets and paint rollers. Yeah, if someone notices you forgot to scan a can of spray foam sticking out of the cart, you just say, oops, must have missed that one. Great stuff. But my lawyer friend says they know what you've been up to. You and everyone just like you. They have cameras, they have AI. You can't opt out, I'm sorry, but it's true. They're building a case and you could be next. One day a letter arrives, a summons, a warrant for your arrest. And that's all she wrote, she said, so please stop, brother. The thing about self-checkout is that it's a trap. They get you to participate, they want you to participate, and you did, because you felt like it afforded you some sort of autonomy. It felt good at first, getting that kind of freedom so easy, the kind of freedom I know you've been after your whole life, brother. The kind that comes with being an artist, the desire to live a beautiful and interesting and absorbing yet somehow moral and ethical life. The freedom to create, to create yourself. But why you? Why you and not everyone else in the world? See, that's how they got you. They appeal to your sense of uniqueness. And I can say this as your sister, I love you, but I'm not sure I like you. They got you to think you deserve to be free, and you just totally forgot they owned you. Yes, they own you. You work for them. They've long figured out the scam, brother, how to make you pay and make you do the work. You really think you were owed for the work you've put in all these years? The work of being alive? Jesus, brother, get with the program. Being alive is at will, their will. And there will be blood. That's really the point. I hate to say it, but that's really the point. You're an employee, bro. Home Depot is so much bigger than you. If they say jump, you say how high. If they say build, you say build what. If they say home, you say sweet. If they say prove it, you say improvement. And of course, if they say check out, you check it out. Am I making myself clear? My sister sounded really intense, and when she sounded intense, that meant she was scared. She made me promise I'd walk the straight and narrow. Shaken, I promised. After we hung up, I cracked open a cold Peroni and took a long hot piss. Then I stared into the bathroom mirror. I looked deep into my own eyes. Who's the boss, baby? I whispered to myself. Who's the boss? I imagined my mug refracted in the store security cameras. I imagined it getting scanned in the self-checkout aisle with its screens and radars and barcodes and infrareds. I imagined all the sample data beamed back to HD Mission Control in Atlanta. All of my pieces coming together, minus the pieces that should have been there. Their product. Who was the product now? My pathetic avatar sweating it out, dreading the big orange hand that would pull my number and make an example out of me for the improvement of mankind. My sister said I took a shortcut when there are no shortcuts. I knew she was right. I knew deep down that the gig was up.
Thanks.
All right, I'm gonna sort of trace the same arc as James's piece without a phone in a different way. So when I first heard about Darren's piece, I thought, which is in Brian Boucher's article, I thought it was really beneath him. I thought it was really stupid. And the reason I thought it was stupid was I thought it was like really suspiciously neat. Like the kind of like idea that every kind of like, first year budding conceptual artist comes up with. And it was beneath an artist whose work was great because it was so messy. And I didn't understand why he was doing something so cute. And it wasn't really until a few months ago that I actually sort of realized that it actually wasn't a gesture at all. It may not even be an artwork. It was a sort of very sincere expression of some kind of despair, or at least that's how I'm choosing to read it, and I'll explain why. At which point I decided it was kind of a masterpiece to the extent that it wasn't an artwork, but an honest attempt to like get out. And my read on this, I'm just gonna just explain for a minute or two why I'm reading it this way. So I was a theater director originally, and I kind of flamed out of theater in New York because I couldn't quite make it do the things that I wanted to make it do, and I didn't understand why. I didn't understand why this thing that was promising this thing wouldn't do this other thing that I thought it would do. So with my tail between my legs, I went to Berlin, which I don't even like, by the way, and I never liked it. But I kind of had my tail between my legs, and it was cheap, and there was nowhere to go. So I went there, and this what follows is going to make me sound incredibly naive and stupid. And the reason I'm talking about the theater directing is just I didn't go to art school or anything like that. This was in 2007, 2008. And it turned out that the things I wanted to do with theater, you could actually do in galleries. And I got swept up kind of in this moment that you were talking about in the film of like 2007, 2008 pre-crash, where like a lot of things seemed possible to do, that weren't going to necessarily give you an ROI. And so I wound up kind of getting swept up in this like wave. This is when Performa had like a few years after Performa had started, and everyone was into like performance, and galleries were really taking on, what were essentially loss leaders, and they were in a position to take it on because it made them seem virtuous. Like, oh, I'm representing this person who doesn't make anything. So here's a person who doesn't make anything, who also doesn't know anything. And I'm like, oh, this is fucking great. I can like show my work in galleries. This is so much better than showing my work in theaters. This is gonna go on forever. And it went on for like, I didn't have any reason to realize why it wouldn't, because it was working for me. And it went on for about 4 or 5 years. And then I got dropped by one gallery, and I got dropped by another gallery, and I was like really perplexed, and that was it for the galleries, and and I started getting really like sad, and I just didn't get it. And my wife at some point said to me, like, what the fuck do you expect? You don't make objects. These places are in the business of selling objects. That is what keeps them afloat. Why in the world would they want to retain an artist who doesn't make anything you can sell? And I was like, oh, I just thought they were showing me because they liked my stuff. But then I was like, okay, well, yeah, that, and for a while I just would look back on, it would like, for basically, I was going to title every subsequent work, Fuck This and Fuck You, for like #1s through whatever for a few years. But I was like, okay, well, at least there's artists like Darren Bader, right? Like, I get it. It's like painting and sculpture. These are objects. You could maybe make them. As you said, this is cyclical. Like, the market occasionally supports stuff you can sell. And I'm not claiming any special virtue in stuff that you can't sell at all. But sometimes it supports artists who make, broadly saleable work, artists without a brand, artists whatever. It supports some with a brand, longer than others. But ultimately, it comes for a lot of people, and I didn't actually think it would necessarily come for Darren Bader, whose work I love, and he seemed to have found a way out of it. This is why I kind of, and then you've done this whole thing, you think it's going to last forever, even though it's a critique. Like, you can make a living off this critique for a while. You can make a living off of being shifty and evading this stuff, and but you can't really make a living forever being that way, it turns out. And then you have surprise like 2 kids and and a lot of debt, and you live in New York, and your market's dried up, and yeah, like, why wouldn't you want to sell it? So I don't look at this as cute, and I don't necessarily think of this as like, a Warholian kind of, or Duchampian, or name your whatever transfer of identity, or a legal game. Like, and I'm probably stretching it a little bit, but I view it, for me, it's powerful to the extent that it's a sincere attempt to like wrestle with and get out of a bad situation. So.
When I first heard about this piece, I was kind of confused about what to say or what to think about it, because it's kind of just like, yeah, like this is something I would do if I could do it. Like, wouldn't we all do this if we could do it? So I wasn't even actually sure they had heard of Darren Bader. Then I looked into it a little bit and I realized that I had, so that was good. But I wanted to think about if there were any sort of other comparable examples or phenomena that could help me understand what was going on here. So I'll share some examples that I was thinking about that maybe help contextualize this work for me. So in 1964, the poet Marcel Brotars, I had to make a note about to pronounce that correctly, and I think I am, announced his rebirth as an artist when he cast 50 copies of his book, Poncebet, in plaster, and he said then, "I too wondered whether I could not sell something and succeed in life." Finally, the idea of inventing something insincere crossed my mind, and I set to work straight away. In 1998, the artist Ben Kinmont, whose work addresses structure of value in the art world, began a conceptual project entitled "Sometimes a Nicer Sculpture is Being Able to Provide a Living for Your Family." And that project, he founded a business dealing in antiquarian books with a focus on antiquarian gastronomy, which is still operational and, from what I gather, very successful today. So these two works of art, they're thematized by the artist's, desire, or rather need for compensation, which is very relatable. One marks an entry into the profession of art making, so no more poetry, now visual art, now the saleable commodity. The other, I think, like Bader, marks something of, but not quite, an exit. No more art, making a living now, please. Bader has been, I think, admirably transparent. If this work is purchased, the proceeds will help him pay rent, continue to have health insurance, to take care of his 2 children. Again, it's very relatable. So the question for me was, is this a work of art that is about identity? And then I was like, is being an artist an identity? Not in the sense that we generally use that term today in strictly defined sense, but rather, to me, this seems to be a work about remuneration, about value, and I think ultimately in the end, escape. I am, however, thinking about the impossibility of this straightforward and transparent gesture if it had been inflected by the race or gender of its creator. So, we can imagine a Black man, we can imagine a Black woman attempting this project, which would immediately and maybe exhaustingly become a statement about the fungibility of the raced body, the commodification of racialized labor or sexual capacity, a gesture that would be immediately scarred by history. And then I looked into it more. We actually do not have to imagine if this were to be the case. On August 8th, 2001, the artists Mendy and Keith Obadike listed Keith's blackness for auction on eBay. Its buyer would receive a certificate of authenticity, conferring upon them the right to make Black art, to write critical essays or scholarships about other Blacks and make jokes about Black people, and or laugh at Black humor comfortably, among other benefits. Or it would have if eBay had not removed the listing in 4 days. Mindy and Keith included some disclaimers on the auction. They said the seller does not recommend that this Blackness be used in the process of making or selling serious art. The seller does not recommend that this Blackness be used in legal proceedings of any sort. I think of other artists who have assumed the identity of the commodity, however briefly, who have maybe fetishized themselves as animate goods. Maybe you're familiar, in 1993, Glenn Ligon created an installation of shipping crates and wanted posters that represented him, the artist, as Henry Box Brown, the slave who mailed himself to freedom. And in that case, a human who was property temporarily became, even more like an object, a saleable good en route to freedom. And then, Box Brown interestingly created an entire brand. He used that identity that happened in that process of shipping to become an international celebrity. And he toured across Europe and America for decades and with a show in which he repeatedly restaged his own escape. It was immensely popular and very weird, the documentation reveals. But I think the parallel only goes so far. I think for Bader, he really hopes someone will actually buy his practice. And Mendy and Keith knew that Keith's blackness could never actually be bought or sold. Indeed, were Bader's work to have been created by a Black person or another person of color, I think like no collector or institution could possibly have bought it because owning Black people is not allowed. I really wonder, I just wanted to think about, what makes art valuable? The Craigslist posting selling Bader's practice suggests that this work of art, this opportunity to make and sell workers or respected artists, is valuable because of the form and trajectory of his career up until this point. And they offer evidence in the form of his profile in the New York Times, in Vogue, his gallery representation, exhibitions, museum acquisitions. And what other circumstances has art become valuable in? I have been thinking recently, because of a show at the Met, about the case of the enslaved artist who has been known as Dave the Potter, whose name is David Drake. And in his case, it's the fact of his enslavement that accrues a value to the massive earthenware pots that he created during his life, and accrues prestige to the museums who have paid record-breaking sums to acquire them. So Bader's career as an artist is what makes his professional identity valuable. With David Drake, it was his unfree status, his joblessness, because he was a slave, that yielded this profit for his owner during his life and continues to accrue value for the people who own his work after his death. This isn't all really meant as a gotcha. I'm just trying to think about, instances of value, how it attaches to art, where it comes from, when and why. And I think, it for me, helps me reflect on the position from which this work of art can and does operate. I think, the transparency of Bader's ploy is useful. It may not tell us anything new. I think when I was thinking of this, I was like, what new data do we gain from this? I think basically none. It doesn't tell us anything we aren't already aware of, but maybe it points it up a little. One of the jobs of critique, I think, is to identify the limits to thought and culture that are attributable to capitalism. And I think Bader's work really does identify those limits very successfully and capitalizes on them. Maybe you all heard earlier this month, the Kunsten Museum in Denmark sued the artist Jens Honning for his failure to deliver a work of art made out of approximately $50,000, it was krone, but 50,000 US dollars in cash that the museum gave him for the purpose. Instead of delivering that work of art, Honning drops off 2 empty canvases titled "Take the Money and Run," which the museum displayed in an exhibition on labor conditions. And it seems like Honning is going to have to give the money back, which I think is really too bad. When it comes to Bader, I guess I kind of want him to get away with it. I'm rooting for him. I think it would be nice. It would be nice to get out of a tyrannical, exhausting, rapacious, competitive precondition for earning and for survival. And it would be really nice to get out with a comfortable cushion, with a soft place to land, to have an easy out, even if it is, as the title of this program suggests, a hard sell. So it really just makes me wonder, an exit for Bader, an exit for who else? Like, who else is escape possible for? Anyone. So that's all.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, James. Thank you, David. Dena, I'm going to interrogate you, but if you have things to say off the bat, you can also just go for it.
Yeah, I'll run with a few thoughts. I really appreciate, Rachel, you going through the historical context of this having been something that is done and explored from many different angles before. And I think that what maybe I can bring to this table is just a very contemporary look at what and how people are packaging and selling their identities today. I thought the Craigslist post was interesting, and I just learned that it was more of a promo and wasn't actually the work, which I feel like maybe other people had the same question. Because the question that I was coming to was like, well, you know, where is this sale happening? Who's brokering it? Are his galleries involved? And there's this kind of hesitance that I'm reading in the whole project. And something that is interesting to me about Craigslist is that it's hyper locally demarcated. It's not Instagram or Facebook Marketplace or any of these other non-spaces. It's a New York City post. And I think that Darren's practice and his like need to get out in a way is very much in response to this city itself. So I feel like whatever conversation we're having about Darren's project is a very New York conversation. So just want to root that in what we're talking about. And then the other thing is that, you know, maybe some of these more like grand gestures that other artists have done in the past, you know, they stand against a backdrop where this isn't daily practice. Whereas today we're seeing like most artists functioning like bedroom brands on their own, and it might be a more kind of like saleable or financially viable way forward. And I have seen younger artists doing that where they're just selling directly to their audiences on Instagram versus this kind of multi-mediated art world that I think we're all, you know, we're all here, so we're all part of it in some sense. But I think that, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Darren try to sell an Instagram account before? How did that go?
He successfully sold an Instagram account and the Twitter account for, I can never remember how to pronounce it, Mind Oud. In 2018, Mind Oud, yeah. But I don't know for how much. But that was, yeah, so there are precedents in terms of the sale of artifacts of his practice or person. And he's done another work where he auctioned cash via Sotheby's or Christie's.
Cool. Yeah, I think I just want to bring up that this is part of a larger thread in his practice, and that it, you know, while it seems pretty drastic, it is part of a mode of making and selling and packaging his work that he's done in the past. Yeah, I mean, I think that so I'm an artist, I write, I also do brand consulting, and looking at this project from like that lens, it's messy in a way that seems driven out of its own just material need, and I empathize a lot with that. It's you know, the New York Times profile, this panel, the documentary, all of these things would not exactly be like the media plan that one would draw up unless it's like, I need to sell this now. And kind of to what you're saying, that, you know, that kind of fire sale approach is something that I don't think that Darren's alone in his situation. And that's something that I would maybe just want to call out, is that it's like he's speaking from a very individual kind of like atomized position in relation to his own identity, when this could be more of a collective endeavor. What that would look like, I don't know, and I don't have the shape of that, but I think maybe that's up for a conversation.
Just drawing on I think that idea of collectivity is something I would definitely love to come back to, and if anyone else wants to jump in, please do so. As a brand consultant, I'm curious, you know, what is your assessment? Where is the value in Darren Bader?
In Darren specifically, I think we kind of talked about this over email. If someone were to invest in this and look at what the monetary value would be, they'd have to look at a lot of like soft metrics of what his audience and reach were, which is all obfuscated on so many layers in the art world. You don't know who his collectors are, you don't know who his audience is or his reach, but I think that, you know, everybody in this room is a testament to the fact that like Darren's work means something to people. So I think that whoever buys this, I would hope, would have some personal investment in the ongoing production of Darren Bader art. But the other question to ask was like, is it, from an investment standpoint, does it make sense when you can use something like a little Michaela or an AI and create some other persona, Hatsune Miku, something else that could be stood in without a very embodied subjectivity to negotiate with? I don't know.
Yeah, I know. In your writing, one of the things that you've touched on is this kind of formula of artist as X, right? Like artist as, for instance, brand consultant, or an era when sort of like LARPing as a different profession was an ability to do different kinds of things, potentially like less rigorously or in a stranger way, but also was a model that you saw a lot of artists working in a particular time. And, I think thinking about Darren in this moment, it's like, well, artist as not artist, does that fit into that formula? And then thinking about the sale as well, what do we get from thinking of the inverse of like blank as artist? Is that valuable to folks beyond its sort of like brand metrics?
I mean, I think that maybe this is addressing something embedded within this question, which is like a question of authenticity, because Darren Bader is Darren Bader, and I feel like, the attitude or the way that he makes work or just presents himself as an artist is very much one-to-one, and there's not much of a performance distantiating those two things. And I think that's, I don't know, maybe some of the examples, the historical examples sort of disembody the self in different, different ways. Maybe it's like a Gen X-y thing. Yeah.
I think one thing I just wanted to toss in that I think really sort of comes through in your essay is that Darren, like he and I DM'd briefly, and he was just like, I'm just not interested in serial production. And I think one thing that Alex kind of points out is that there are artists who are brands. There are artists who can really churn out a consistent set of things. You'd be like, oh, that's somebody. And yeah, sure, if you see guacamole in a tuba, odds are who it is. But there's just so many, like, it's not a good brand because it wasn't a great brand to begin with because of his style of production. And that in itself devalued. There was no brand recognition necessarily. So even then when you're like that, yeah.
I'm not even going to try to unpack what we mean by brand here, but I do think that that's like the complexity of his practice, the language-basedness of it, and like the nuance and slippage that is inherent in that work makes it like a really, slippery thing. So it's not like a Koons or something.
Yeah, one question that has kind of been plaguing me, especially because so as part of this project, Darren was keeping I don't think it was quite daily, but it was a pretty regular journal over the course of the past year, kind of like documenting his emotional state in relation to this project, and maybe just also kind of like random thoughts and other things. But it's pretty extensive. It's like 50 pages and 25,000 words. But one of the things that really struck me when I was reading back through all of that was this exactly what was coming up, this notion of like sincerity and its relationship to structures of value. And something that, I think I've learned throughout this project is like Darren is extremely sincere. It's not only that it's not a performance, but I think he like means his work in a way that I don't think it often gets read, which is that he's like interested in the poetics of what you experience when you are looking at a tuba filled with guacamole and how you encounter that and how it then reflects back on your everyday life and other things you're encountering in the world and how it changes the other experiences you have. And I think in public he often gets read as more of a prankster, or he's someone who is like tooling with the market in a more mercenary or direct kind of way. And in fact, I think he's like operating on a level, at least I think he believes himself to be operating on this level of poetics, actually. And so Rachel, in your statement, you were saying that I'm not sure that this like tells us anything new, though it is useful to have the discussion and experience it. And there is, I think as many of us has noticed, no, this is like an actually inherent, like very sincere gesture. And I wonder if there are any perceived poetics to it in that way, or something that we get from sitting with it as, an affective experience rather than a one-liner or a ploy.
Yeah. The formula artist as X, I was like thinking about that. And, as someone who is not an artist, I've always been kind of, I don't know, like troubled, maybe annoyed by like when an artist is like, I'm doing this now, but this is my practice. And it's like, you are I don't know, like you're doing whatever like thing that if anyone else were to do it, it would not be an artistic practice, but because you're doing it, like it gets to be art. And it's like relates to what you were saying about like, you know, the kind of the freedom to do whatever, and like art as a certain kind of like license. I guess I find that freedom troubling, but then as I was thinking of this piece, I was like, oh, like this is, and I guess, you know, one thing that is difficult about it is that something the artist like takes on the postures of like work, like the artist as job doer, they get to maintain a kind of critical distance and they're not like really the worker, they're just doing the work, and that's like somehow troubling. But actually this piece is not like that. I think it is sincere. I think it's transparently sincere. And when I first thought, I was like, is this institutional critique? Does it have an ironic edge? It's like, no, this is like a really sincere request for $1 million. And like, I mean, like, I don't know if I would say there's like, I guess there's an everyday poetics of that in which, you know, we can all deeply experience how that desire, that an identical desire. But, you know, his work, when I was first thinking about it, I was like, oh, this is a guy who, as you say, fills a tuba with guacamole. This is a guy who lets some goats loose in a gallery. And I was like, it is so, it is, I was like, this is a project about accruing value to valueless objects, to valueless acts. But actually, I am inclined to think about it more as actually a career of meaningful encounters, of accruing like things beyond like monetary value to like things like just lasagna and tubas and whatnot. So
I think the real point of resemblance is not Bob Dylan. I think it's Jonathan Richman, actually. Like this is like a big ode to the government center. It's not like.
I think like Darren is not an influencer yet, but I'm reminded of like, Dena, something you wrote about creatives as influencers and their appeals to authenticity and legitimacy. You wrote that in the past, art and the artist's identity were largely incongruous with such relatability, but then the contemporary precariat emerged, whose lives and livelihoods are oh so relatable to those of the artist. And I feel like this work is actually like, sort of exemplary in that fashion, and yet also I'm not sure it's relatable unless you are experiencing the economic conditions that motivate the sale.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to caveat that I wrote that essay like over 5 years ago, and it's a very, I don't know, shit's changed, to say the least. But artists serve as examples for a certain way of being. That's a really dumb thing to say, but I think it's true. And I think that what Darren's maybe demonstrating is one way to flame out, as you put it. And I think that that's, you know, he does have a platform and he is saying, hey, this is an option because he's trying to do it for himself.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this work is like on some levels, like a conflation of a voice or style and a brand, but while also severing the person from the brand or the public representation that gives value to the work. And I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what's the difference between a voice and a brand? Especially considering like the value of authenticity, which to me seems to sort of exist in opposition to like brand stability, for instance. And I think like James, your work is so concerned with authenticity, and I think you specifically at some point in an interview like talked about the difference between like what it means to have a voice versus what it means to have a brand, and like you mentioned Knausgaard as a figure that you know who's maybe both at once without it being his fault.
And that that quote was also from a while ago, but 1947, the year I was born. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a brand expert, but I do think the voice is particular, and the brand is generic, and there's some sort of connection between the two in that sense. And when you start to generalize a voice, you cheapen it, frankly. But I don't know how that's to be avoided once your voice becomes a kind of pattern.
Yeah, I guess what I can add to it is like in the work that I do, not as an artist, as consultant or something, but when I'm working with brands that want to work with artists, they don't usually want to work with the artists that we're speaking of. And I think that understanding that the art world is multiverse and that there is more, Darren's not a creator. And I think that's a distinction that we need to make here. He is an artist. And I think that when we're talking about some of the identities that get commodified or the people that get tapped as being influencers, they're way more in a nebulous space where they're doing more self-marketing and you can't really like identify the content outside of the medium through which it's being disseminated. And Darren's showing objects, heroin-filled burritos, whatever, that don't circulate as fluidly as some of these other very liquid media. So I think that that's maybe a distinction to make when we're having this conversation.
To give Dave Steiner a little shout out, one of my favorite parts of the contract is the selected definitions section, which includes art world means the commercial and cultural system comprising people, businesses, institutions, and other entities that create, reproduce, distribute, exhibit, display, publish, perform, market, offer for sale, sell, fund, collect, analyze via writing or other forms of expression, and otherwise engage with works. And then artist means the creator of a body of works that has been recognized by and deemed to have cultural value within the art world. So just in case we were using language that anyone was not entirely clear on, we have these useful definitions. And James, the other thing I wanted to ask you about your billboard project, because that is a place where you're definitely playing with both brand and voice.
I kind of forgot I did that.
So long ago.
Yeah, it's like 6 months ago.
Like 3 years?
Yeah.
So much has changed.
What do you want to know about it?
Well, I think you're, I don't know, it's a work that I have thought about a lot, but don't feel like I fully grasp, which I love. Like I love when something keeps giving me mystery, but it also has these very different elements. So it's this series of billboards, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was invited to put up a series of billboards in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've never been to Tulsa. I didn't get to see the billboards, but they were up for a while, for a month. I don't do public art, but I did for 1 month. And yeah, they were sort of replicas of the branding, color scheme and text scheme of Dunkin' Donuts promotional phrases, I suppose, with severe spelling errors. That's pretty much it.
And in the description of the project, you know, I think in a kind of like what I would call characteristically voicey James narrative, you describe how this came out of how your initials and it being you worrying about the increasing reduction of Dunkin' Donuts' name to something that is akin to your initials.
Yeah, their move into being DK and Dunkin' DNKN, my initials JNKW, they started getting conflated in searches. And also I noticed if I would look up my initials on Twitter, X, I guess, the misspelling of the word no, KNOW, would always be JNKW. So it'd be like, I JNKW, what's going on? I don't JNKW, what's going on? So this sort of loss of control over my initials and the sort of move into the franchise world of Dunkin' Donuts, it tripped me up. And so I decided to take control in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Okay, yeah, maybe we'll do one more question and then open it up to Q&A. What's your Darren Bader? Or let's say someone here tonight wants to give you between $500,000 and $1 million to support your acquisition of Darren Bader. Curious what you would do and which, if any, parts of that name or practice would be most compelling or financially promising to you. Or if you can't think of anything, do you have visions of other people, other entities, and what you would like for them to do?
I strongly feel, I feel like this wasn't super discussed in the material, that the obvious outcome is that Darren will work for whomever purchases him. And he'll just become a freelancer. He's like, qualified.
Okay, so we did talk about a potential arrangement along these lines, which seemed too complicated, but where Triple Canopy would sell the work, and it would be a tax-deductible donation. Although that doesn't make sense legally, but let's say it does. And then we would put the funds in a high yield savings account or something. Then we would employ Darren and give him an annual stipend plus healthcare, and that could act as a model for us to do something comparable for other artists in the future. And then there would be no more exploitation of artists, and everything that anyone who is of interest to us does will be sustainable forever.
Just working away in a basement.
And then we won't have to, and then that will be the new source of support, not only for Triple Canopy, but for all comparable nonprofit arts organizations until the end of time. And all we need is buyers.
So he's the savior. He's like...
Yeah, it didn't work out, but we also didn't try that hard.
Yeah, from his journal, real quick, too, Darren has received a few offers. He wrote, I think in June sometime, that since the New York Times article came out, I've received a handful of offers. One was art practice in exchange for private jet. Another was very involved and very intelligent, and was very involved and very intelligent, and I bet I'll comment on it in greater depth at some point. He never does. A third offered $1,000 Canadian. Email address was an immigration lawyer's, though the signature didn't match. Perhaps one of the lawyer's clients. A fourth offered to swap practices. Hers is painting. She'd offer me lessons if I don't know how to paint. I don't.
Do you all know the story of what happened to Colonel Sanders, the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken? No, really? He actually did sell, he sold, well, it was not KFC at that point, it was Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he was a colonel who knew how to fry chicken, and he sold this small franchise to somebody at some point, and then he kind of ran out of money. It was a shitty contract, at which point he was forced, but Kentucky Fried Chicken just wound up expanding, and it was like King Lear. He was forced to wander the land at KFC's, performing being Colonel Sanders, although he was in fact Colonel Sanders. So there's a model for this. I think thinking about it realistically, because really what artist could afford to buy this practice? What artist would be a good match for this practice? And you could think of consortia who might add up, or maybe one or two artists. But really, if you really want to think about it realistically, it would just be the only interested parties with $1 million lying around might actually be Gagosian or a gallery. So I was thinking maybe a gallery could buy the practice, and then they could just shove all kinds of random shit in it, and just make it this weird fire hose spewing whatever they can't sell as Darren Bader. And Darren Bader would just become a metonym for all this unsellable trash. I'm not saying this is a good outcome. I'm just saying I want him to get $1 million. I just can't imagine any other institution paying $1 million other than, a mega blue chip gallery.
I don't know if that's just making me think of, I don't know if there are any other people in here from Georgia, but in Athens, Georgia, there's a tree that owns itself. So it could be the kind of thing where somebody buys Darren Bader and puts it in the public trust to just stand as this monument.
That would be nice.
That'd be nice.
I really don't know. All I can think of is if I had $1 million to buy Darren Bader, I would just use $1 million to do something else. I really just, if he makes, I don't want to have to make art. I don't know. It just seems too hard. So.
Yeah, Alex has one more question.
Sorry. I wonder also about alternatives and collective models. And Rachel, I just wonder if you could talk a bit about something you noted elsewhere in the document about a collective model that seems like, if not a contemporary viable alternative, like a useful historical example to think about?
Oh yeah, my document.
The document.
When I was trying to think of historical precedents, I was, Rachel read us some language from the contract, and I was reading that contract myself. I was like, oh, this reminds me a little bit of something I learned about relatively recently, which is the 1990 Indian Arts and Crafts Act, which was a reaction on the part of the US government to create what essentially amounts to a brand for indigenous people making art. The problem was that a lot of people who were not indigenous in the United States were making art and selling it as if it was. And so in order to secure a stable right to make different kinds of things, weavings, pottery, it is now illegal to make indigenous art if you are not yourselves tribally enrolled. And on the one hand, it is a response to a sort of rapacious capitalist system of production. It's a response to increased desire for these types of goods, but it's also it's a protective gesture for a group of people who are making art, and it permitted many people to continue to make a livelihood in this way. And so I think, I'm not calling for federal maybe I am calling for federal legislation to preserve the right for art making for people, but I think it just makes me think. But on the other hand, it's a little bit troubling, because when we're talking about branding and we're talking about identity, it makes identity a brand, and it closely aligns with the demand for authenticity in production. So at what cost was this protective gesture established? It turned people into brand. So a trade-off there.
Okay, now we keep saying that we're going to throw it to the audience, but I have one more question as well. I think one of the things you said in your remarks also, Rachel, was, posing this question of, is being an artist an identity? And you were saying that you don't make art, so we're not going to ask you, though you can weigh in. But I'm curious, Dena, David, and James, how you think about that, because, my knee-jerk reaction is always to say, well, I don't want it to be. I want, art making to be more aligned with our professions and, have it be compensated as labor and these kinds of things, like dentistry. And, if a dentist is like, well, I'm going to sell my dentistry practice, which is kind of the parallel that Darren keeps referring to, no one after the dentist has sold his practice and become something else, whether it's a psychotherapist or, a public school teacher or whatever, no one's like, you'll always be a dentist at heart, though. No one's saying that. Whereas if someone was an artist and then sells their practice or exits or refers, I feel like there's this lingering aura, and people are always pointing back to it. And there's in fact an entire book about artists who have left the art world, but they're still being regarded as artists. So.
You'll always be a theater guy to me.
That's what Kelly says towards the end, right? She's like, he'll be back, which just seems like really incredibly misreading what's going on.
I think people do sell their dental practices, though.
No, they definitely do. But then no one after they sell the dental practice is saying, you'll always be a dentist to me.
Well, there was one of those Seaport talks, Bridget Donahue, which was recent, about sort of all the galleries closing down, and Bridget Donahue was one of the guests, and she was saying that it seemed just kind of a bummer that you couldn't sell a gallery the way you could sell a dentist practice. That theoretically it's a business. It's not like art as an identity. And yet, whenever it almost has to be lineal, because it's it operates on connections in a way that, you could sell a practice and you'll probably keep a lot of the clients, at least for a while, as a dentist. But the entire legally defined art world is running so much on personal connections that it's not just artists who can't sell the practice. It's actually gallerists who can't sell the practice too.
But don't you but you would take on like a protege and train them, right? I mean, isn't that?
But it doesn't work out that way.
Yeah,
like,
I think.
you know, I mean, you give it to you give it to like your fail sons or fail daughters, or your success sons or success daughters, and like, but you don't really take on a protege, or they don't operate under that name most of the time. It has a moment, and then it kind of fades when, yeah.
I was just going to add, I do think it's like, there's this great tragedy when it comes to people who give up being an artist. And, I feel like I have kids, and every kid is raised to think that they're potentially an artist, and then there's sort of this process of elimination. It's like this brutality. And then you take on your actual profession. And then they sort of, as an adult, look around at the survivors. I get that when I go home to my home state. They're like, "Oh, you're an artist. Oh, it's lovely, lovely. You made it." And it's intense,
Even if you were genuinely happier being a psychotherapist or a realtor, no one would believe you. They'd be like, "How brave,"
Yeah, you're not supposed to do it. Which state? Maine. Massachusetts and Maine. Yeah. I'm a New England boy.
All right, we've breached. What other audience questions do we have? All right.
Okay, I'm going to bring this mic to anonymous audience member number 1.
Hey, I guess I have a question about what the status is of Darren's sale, because I was looking at his website a couple months ago, and there was a time parameter. I thought I saw a time parameter where that if it wasn't sold by a certain point in time, that it would come off the market, and has it moved beyond that? Like, is it still going on, or like what happens if it doesn't sell?
Yeah, I can only say that it will be for sale at least for the next few weeks or so, and like maybe tonight we could offer a discount, or we could like revise the contract since Dave is here also, if anyone wants to negotiate. And like if it doesn't sell, I think it would be hard for me to answer that question for Darren. I think we could only speculate.
I think he wants the sale to be over, but we have encouraged him to keep it open for a little while longer.
We've delayed the sale by delaying the publication of this work for at least a couple months, but it's because we care, I think, and because we want to cut. I also want to give Pacho and Dave a chance to speak if they're interested, but no pressure.
This is kind of more of like a statement than a question, but I was just curious if anyone had thoughts on artist visas. I have a couple friends who are here in the States and have applied to be here because they're artists, so they identify themselves that way. And it's like, I guess living in the United States is maybe you could say a privilege or like a status thing that not everyone is able to have. I don't know, just like another wrinkle in this like artist identity thing.
Do you want to add to that or respond with the
Dave, tell us more.
Not legal advice, but okay. I'm not sure. Do any of you have?
I mean, I don't know anything about artist visas, but there are other countries that pay you to be an artist too, right? So being in America is not all it's not gravy. I mean, it's necessarily. I mean,
say like there's lots of people that want to be in America, and that's one way.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that they are like.
They have to continually prove it.
And I don't know how long they have to continue being an artist.
Right.
But
I don't think it particularly, it's not exclusive to visual artists by any means, though, and the language around it is also very strange. It's like exceptional alien or something like that. Yeah, Simone, thank you. Fact checks. Maybe let the person who's raising their hand answer the question, and then if Dave wants to say something, we can continue to peer pressure him.
Hi, thanks. So there's a legal definition of art, and there's a definition of the art world in the contract, but I haven't heard anything about the actual parameters of the art practice or how they would be stipulated by any artist that would purchase this practice. And I'm just wondering, does Darren think that's problematic? What if an artist with enough money to make this purchase, what if they decide to produce art that's really transgressive or problematic, or is not art that Darren himself would be comfortable with being produced under his name? And if he's given any thought to that, because that just kind of seems to be foremost in my mind. Anybody who buys his practice can produce any sort of art, unless there's a stipulation for it in the contract.
I think it's unrestricted in the contract. I mean, I think it's explicitly unrestricted in the contract.
Yeah, maybe this is something
Dave,
Steiner could speak to.
Do you want to answer, or should I?
Well, I have a question maybe as this mic
Yeah.
gets traveled. I didn't understand if Darren had created an externalized entity that he's selling. Like, did he have to incorporate or?
Yeah, it's technically Moses Hosiery LLC. Or
But
Corp.
that was his pre-existing LLC. He did not incorporate that just for the sale.
Yeah, but that and the there aren't restrictions. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the contract with me right now. I was trying to pull it up on my phone. We did discuss that point. So, and I can't remember how we resolved it. I think there might be something in the contract that says, if you produce things that are hateful or racist or, misogynistic. And I'm not certain. Triple Canopy will be publishing it. It's already on the website, so you can look and see but we did consider that issue.
I mean, there is like a Martin Shkreli kind of outcome to this, right? Like I'm gonna buy this practice and just fill it with toxic trash.
Yeah, and the contract also stipulates that Darren is not allowed to publicly denounce or trash or diminish the value of the work produced by the buyer, at least based on a subjective understanding of the quality of the work.
Thank you. I have another contract-related question about whether or not there's any kind of stipulations about like the secondary market of this work, if there is such a thing. I was thinking about like artist royalties and like not trying to get into an NFT conversation per se, but I wondered if Darren had thought about like if somebody were to resell that work and what that might mean for the artistic output of that.
You're talking about new works that would be created by the buyer, because the buyer does not receive like existing works created by the artist currently known as Darren Bader remain authored by
So the buyer would have the right to assign the agreement to another person. So yes, the buyer could assign it and sell it to another person. Yeah, I mean, to the extent that the contract sort of embodies the work, the buyer would have the right to assign it to somebody, for purchase or to a museum,
I think
and then the subsequent buyer would receive all of the rights that the buyer. It's in the assignment clause if you look it up on the website.
One of the kind of interesting, things about it that is sort of like, I met a guy once at a wedding whose job was to buy up dead brands, like Jordache. He was completing a purchase of Jordache, which had been moribund for like 20 years, but it was still kicking around. And you could see a situation where like, no one quite cancels the sale. Someone picks up Darren Bader as a brand, 10 years from now for like 10 grand and produces jeans, like Darren Bader jeans. Which under the term of the contract would be artworks. Like, because any output under the name Darren Bader, right, it's not strictly speaking art. Is that correct? No, yes? That wasn't being rhetorical.
That's why the agreement has a definition for art world and
Okay.
works.
So you do have to produce works within the art world.
Yes, I mean, it's not a license to use the name Darren Bader to produce like Coca-Cola, or a cola or another.
Or any sweetened beverage whatsoever.
Right. It's a license to use the name Darren Bader to produce artworks, and obviously there is a definition in the agreement because, of course, there has to be, which I think reflects maybe an institutional definition, something like that, more or less. But
You would just have to exhibit the jeans in a gallery first and then sell them.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. Pop up within the gallery.
Yeah.
Hey, so there's a history of contract as artwork, and I've heard sort of a wash of, is this an artwork? Is it a negation of an artwork? Is it not an artwork? And I'd love to kind of maybe close this out by figuring out what the panel thinks. Art, not art? What are we talking about here?
I'll say I feel like there's this, we've been fixating on what the purchaser would make as an artwork, and I feel like the logical thing to make is just many more legal actions. Like if I were to purchase him for $1 million, I would probably immediately sue him for access to his previous works, which have probably the most value, and just engage him in many, many legal battles. I'm the rich one, right? So I'll win eventually.
We found the buyer. Who wants to write a check for James?
I mean, it does feel notable that, and we haven't touched on this yet, but Darren's work often is in the form of a contract or some sort of agreement. They're conceptual works. They can take multiple iterations. It's not the specific tuba and the guacamole. It's, if you purchase this as a collector, you're putting the guacamole in the tuba, you're serving it with a certain kind of chips, you're doing this over and over again. And, I think contracts are very much a part of his practice. And so seen through that lens, it's definitely a part of his practice. And I think he, is interested in the art of the contract and was able to work on that with Dave. But I know that, David, you were saying that it makes most sense to you as a not artwork.
I mean, I think not to belittle your question, well, I am going to belittle it, but I feel like what's invested in the is it art question implicitly is always like, is this an exception to reality or is this reality? Like, can we bracket this as a gesture or is this part of reality? I don't really understand the question other than the extent of like, is this trivial or is this, and like set apart from what we go on, what happens every day, or is this part of what happens every day? That seems like at least one thing that's at stake in calling something art, at least in this case. So I guess I feel like, yeah, for me, but I'm also, I get,
I guess it's more where in the gesture, where do you find the art? There's a video, there's a contract, there's a lot of...
It's kind of depend on the outcome, sort of like what happens.
Or is it about the bond, is where is the interest ultimately, or where do you latch on, and maybe where do you take exception?
I think that all of our questions are testament to the fact that I don't think Darren's fetishizing the bureaucracy of it. I think that we are bringing a lot of that to the table maybe, and I appreciate that. It's like, it's not a reified contract. It's something that everybody in this room has a lot of questions about. So I think that, I don't know, maybe that makes some distinction there.
Right, I mean, maybe we're the artwork too. He's going to sell us this talk.
I think ending on the note that we are the artwork feels perfect. James, David, Dena, Rachel, thank you. David, Pacho, Lydia, Francesco, everyone else, thank you. Thank you to all of you for being here. As you may know, Triple Canopy is a nonprofit. All of our events and everything we publish is free and open to the public. So if you've enjoyed this tonight or found it annoying but interesting, please consider supporting Triple Canopy with a tax-deductible donation by Darren. Become a member. My colleague Ceci at the door can help you with any of that. And you can also support us by just hanging out, buying some cheap drinks, and continuing the conversation.
Tip your bartender.
What?
And tip your bartender.
Yeah, tip your bartenders. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.